Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be starting in a moment. You've got about 30 seconds before we go on air. Make sure that your phones are turned to silent, please. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the John Laffan Memorial Lecture for 2025, held at the Anzac Memorial in Hyde Park in Sydney. John Laffan was an Australian historian, very prolific author of over 100 books, most of them related to military history, but some related to poetry and some related to fiction. He was a person who wrote stories, and Families and Friends of the First AIF has kept that tradition of focusing on stories. So in relation to World War I, 360,000 Australian soldiers embarked and participated in World War I. So there are at least 360,000 stories to be told. John wrote most of his books on military history from his experience in travelling the Western Front, travelling to the battlefields of Gallipoli, and to the various places of significance to Australians. He read widely, he wrote widely. He wasn't an academic historian, but somebody who understood history by experiencing it, reading about it, and asking questions. Some of his books you will have seen. They're in libraries, in schools, in universities, and general reading. Many of us had our introduction to the battlefields of World War I through reading the Western Front guides that John wrote, or other books that John wrote. He had a huge collection of artefacts, and he had a very large library. And approximately 10,000 volumes from his library have been donated to the Royal United Services Institute library here in the Anzac Memorial. And so that is effectively the Families and Friends library as well. And if there's anything you wish to know about World War I, there's probably something that John has written about it. Some of it was quite controversial, and you'll see there, for example, he told it as he saw it. He was an opinionated writer of history. He also spent about 20 years travelling the battlefields of the Western Front in particular, in his combi with his young family. And we are privileged today to have one of that young family, who's not quite so young anymore, Craig, his son, here, and his niece, Sue Tung, is present as well. John and his wife Hazel were featured in a newspaper interview at a crucial time in the formation of the Western Front Association in the UK. And what's on the screen at the moment is some of the dialogue where there was some debate about how or whether battlefield archaeology or an interest in the battlefields was in conflict to the commemoration of the memory of the soldiers. And the sort of question that arises is, what would the soldiers have wanted? Would the soldiers have wanted the tears and the solitude every time somebody came to visit them? Or would they want the families to bring the children, to run and laugh? That test of what the soldiers might want has been fundamental to the way in which the Families and Friends of the First AIF operates, founded by John. So, no apologies. John has flavoured the way in which the Families and Friends of the First AIF commemorate the memory of those soldiers. John spent nearly 30 years campaigning for an Australian Corps memorial at Hamel, where the battle planned by Sir John Monash, or General John Monash, planned for 90 minutes, took 93 minutes, and has become one of the textbook or case studies of battle planning in the First World War. Was where all arms were brought together with Air Force, artillery, infantry. So this is John at the first memorial at Hamel, and you'll see it's black granite. And the bottom right corner shows it a few years later, after the frost got into the panels, and when the frost froze, popped the black granite off the memorial. So it's been replaced, and that is the replacement memorial at Hamel. And they are lead soldiers that were given to the first Families and Friends Western Front tour in 2010, made by Shrapnel Charlie from shrapnel that he collected from the Western Front battlefields in his backyard. And we were honoured to be able to put our collection of lead soldiers together like that. That's a unique photograph and very evocative. John is also commemorated, or John and Hazel, by the John and Hazel Laffin bench at Talbot House in Poperingay. Talbot House, a little bit of home beyond the battle lines, still is, largely as it was then, a haven. You can stay there, it's cheap accommodation. It is enriched with great memories and history. And that is Craig and his sisters unveiling the John and Hazel Laffin Memorial at Talbot House, or TOCH. So with that introduction and tribute, I welcome you to the John Laffin Memorial Lecture for 2025. Our main lecture will be presented by Tim Smith, who is a distinguished, he'd probably describe himself as a maritime archaeologist, and he has some very interesting observations. I will let Tim introduce himself a little bit more later on. But our focus today is going to be on the first two Australian submarines, AE1 and AE2, and I'm going to cover some of the context that will then enable Tim to tell his stories about the search for, location of, exploration and identification of AE1 and AE2, and some of his experiences as one of the few people who has dived on both of the wrecks. So, firstly, my task is going to tell you a little bit about the development of the naval forces in Australia, their deployment in 1914, and how AE1 and how AE2 got to be where they were when they were lost. So, being a person who's somewhat inquisitive, my contextual background tries to explore those questions. Why is AE1 where it is? Why is AE2 where it is? And the story will take us through some history and of global events and of different locations. So Australia wasn't always a country with a major navy. And it's out of the colonisation by the British and the international circumstances that prevailed around that, that the Royal Navy set up the Australia Station. So you may recall that 3 days after the landing in Sydney, La Perouse visited Australia for the French. The Dutch had been here, the Portuguese had been here, but it was the British who formed a settlement. So this is a view of ships of the Royal Navy Squadron based in Sydney in 1887. You'll notice that they are sailing ships, a combination of wood and metal. The Australia Squadron was intended to protect the British interests in the Pacific. From 1905, this cruiser, the HMS Powerful, was the flagship of the Australia Squadron of the Royal Navy in Sydney Harbour. You'll see it has 42 guns, 2 big 9-inch guns that you can't see, 12 6-inch guns, 16 3-inch guns, 12 2-inch guns, and 18 torpedo tubes. You'll see the guns on the sides of the vessels. This was pre-Dreadnought. Well, pre-Dreadnought was a revolution in the way things would happen. It actually started with HMS Nelson, and the next class of ship was HMS Dreadnought, that effectively rendered every battleship in the world obsolete. So in Europe had been going through a long period of peace with a few disruptions, and it really came from the settlement of the Napoleonic Wars. So in 1814, the Congress of Vienna settled the demise of the French Republic and the French Revolutionary Wars, and the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. It gave independence to Luxembourg, and afterwards the series of congresses was known as the Concert of Europe, kept the peace for a long period with a few disruptions. So the pressures for peace were about having civilian governments that remained in control of foreign policy, and that the military acted as a stabilising deterrent within that political framework. Importantly, no great power had territorial claims against another great power in Europe. However, there was rivalry elsewhere, as we shall see. There was also the development of an international economy, and that promoted peace. And diplomatic processes and structures sustained the peace with those Congress meetings. So why did peace fail? What caused the end of peace? And if you trace it back, you probably end up in about 1907 or 1911. 1911, effectively, that broke down. And what you saw was other institutions of a nationalistic nature being formed to look after the defence. So Germany had unified in 1870, and we might be familiar with the Schlieffen Plan, which was developed in the 1890s and was current through the 1910s and was largely, well, attempted to be implemented in 1914. In the British Empire, the Committee of Imperial Defence was established in 1902, but then went into abeyance. But by 1907, 1908, it became active again. And it brought together the heads of the Navy, the Army, the government agencies, so the Prime Minister and the ministers. It also brought in the Prime Ministers of the Dominions. And it became the body largely responsible for looking at imperial defence. Out of its work came organisations like MI5, MI6, and the intelligence networks. The planning for World War the planning for war, and the concept of a war book, what would happen in the event of war. Mobilisation plans were all part of that. Other things that were stirring were that the United States had had a war with Spain, started in Cuba, but ended up with Cuba being an American protectorate, as was the Philippines. And that is significant in the story of the submarines. The Great White Fleet of the Americans visited Sydney in 1908, at the time when the then Prime Minister was seeking to have an Australian naval force of its own. And that Committee for Imperial Defence took the pilot of Australia having its own navy, sitting within the framework of an imperial navy. And if that had been successful, it would have then flowed on to Canada and perhaps the other dominions. Within the War Office, they were working on contingency plans, and in particular, the WF scheme, which you might think was the Western Front. But it was the With France scheme. That was its code, and out of it came the planning for mobilisation for an expeditionary force to be in position on the border of Germany inside France within 14 days or so in the event of a war with Germany. While that was happening, Australia was getting its first warships. The two river-class destroyers, Yarra and Parramatta arrived in 1911. They were welcomed in Sydney at the Sydney Cricket Ground with a patriotic welcome in March 1911, and that's my grandfather's program of the event. They then, as the Australian Navy, that's the entire Australian Naval Force. It wasn't a Royal Australian Navy, it was the entire Australian Naval Force with 2 4-inch guns. They did a shakedown cruise up the east coast, called in at Coffs Harbour, had a great welcome, went right up to the Cape, turned around, came back. In Coffs Harbour, there were civic receptions, and the local rifle club challenged them to a rifle shoot. Well, they didn't have time for that on the trip up, but on the trip back they did. And here is the officers of the Yarra and the Parramatta with the Coffs Harbour Rifle Club, and my great-grandfather is far right. So, that was 1911. In 1913, Australia received the HMAS Australia, an indefatigable class battle cruiser commissioned in June, so it was brand new, came out, it had 4 12-inch guns. It had 16 4-inch guns, so the firepower just in its secondary armaments far more than the Parramatta and the Yarra had. And it had 18 torpedo tubes. It was welcomed in to Sydney Harbour. The fleet arrived on the 4th of October 1913, and there's my grandfather's handwritten note that as a 16-year-old boy, he was out on one of the little launches that you might see in those photos there, because his next door neighbour worked for the fisheries department and got him out to see it up close. Also coming in was the HMAS Melbourne, entering the harbour for the first time there, and the HMAS Sydney. That's a slightly later photo because it has the AE1 and the AE2 tucked in beside it. So the AE1 and the AE2 were made in England or in Britain, and they came out in March 1914. There you'll see them coming in firstly to Portsmouth and then passing out as they leave England on their way to Australia. The 13,000-mile journey was the longest journey the submarines had made. They were towed for most of the journey, but they also travelled by surface. It took them some time to come, so there's the journey they took to reach Sydney. And once they got to Sydney, they needed a few repairs. So they needed maintenance. Somewhere there'd been propellers replaced along the way. Further replacements took place, and then they went up the coast to Cairns. And there is HMAS Sydney with both of the submarines in Cairns. So just to remind you, that was March 1914. This graphic out of the official history shows the development of the Australian Navy, firstly in 1911, which were the ships of the Australia Station. 1912, you can see HMS Powerful there, and then the bottom one of 1914. So you can see it's dominated by HMAS Australia. Then you have from the left Melbourne, Sydney, Encounter, which were the same class, and then the smaller class of Parramatta, Warrego, Yarra and Protector as the destroyers. They were seen as part of the Imperial Navy, the Royal Navy. And so as one of the terms and conditions, that little asterisk of Australia, you can have your Royal Australian Navy, is that in times of conflict, it will be signed over to the command of the Royal Navy. And this is the Royal Navy in line up around Scapa Flow in Scotland. Those who attended last year's John Laffan Memorial Lecture may remember that I spoke about the visit of the Duke of Gloucester to unveil or open this building, the Anzac Memorial in Sydney. One of the things he took back with him was a coat worn by Lord Nelson, and another thing he took back was a handwritten account of the Battle of the River Nile by Nelson. Now, given that Nelson had lost his right arm, it possibly was written by somebody else as a copy of his dispatch. But at that Battle of the River Nile in 1798 effectively made Britain the naval power, the predominant naval power in the world for the next 150 years. So that force, they are battleships, costing about £2 million each or so, a great line of them. However, across the way, across the Channel, Germany had unified in the war against France that saw the transfer of Alsace-Lorraine to the Germans. It also embarked on a unification program and a major armaments program. They came very late to the concept of colonisation amongst the European powers. And Germany put a lot of effort into trying to establish a system of colonies around the world, and in particular in Africa. So you'll see there some German colonies of Togoland, Cameroon, German East Africa, German Southwest Africa. Germany embarked on building a navy, a very significant navy. And these are the reports in papers, the top one in Rockhampton, the top one in Bendigo, the other one in Rockhampton from 1911. And the Rockhampton one says, Krupp's is employing 70,000 men, an increase of 22,000 men within the year. 4 ships for the German type, Germany's Dreadnought, have been launched, 4 others are being built, and 5 are being laid down. In addition, 9 cruisers, 24 torpedo boats, 6 submarine vessels and 2 gunboats are under construction. This image shows the German Navy 1st and 2nd battleship squadrons and small cruisers. It doesn't say whether there is a 3rd or a 4th, but you can be assured they wouldn't be far behind. So, what does that mean for Australia and our submarines? This is what the Pacific was looking like, or the Southwest Pacific was looking like around 1910, 1911. And you can see Russia, what we would regard as China, being part of the Russian influence zone, and then the Japanese influence zone. So the powers in the east were Japan and then European powers. Of course, the red denotes British Empire. The Dutch had the Netherlands or the Dutch East Indies, including Western, what we would call New Guinea. The Germans had the northern part of East New Guinea, and the British had the southern half. And the Germans had various islands, the Carolines, the Marshalls, and up in where China is, you'll see there is Qingdao or Qingdao, it marked as German. And you'll see there that the United States is identified as the power for Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Midway, Leeward Islands, and Hawaii. So the United States had a very strong interest in the region as well. In the German East Asia Squadron in China, this was the German fleet. And you'll see there are two fairly large ships and others fairly small. Some of the ships from the German East Asia Squadron will come and be serviced in Australia. And this image from 1911 from Families and Friends member, Professor Richard Wright, shows two of the German ships in Mort's Dock in Balmain being refitted. You'll notice that they are still sailing ships. They were the last ships fitted with auxiliary sails. So this is 1912. And we talked about the submarines arriving here in 1914. Those ships carried 4-inch guns. So here they are in Sydney and in Melbourne. So they were frequent visitors to this part of the world. They were joined by a ship that we know of, the SMS Emden. The SMS Emden had 4-inch guns, and you can see its armaments there. Had 10 4.1-inch guns. And those of you who have come into this memorial from the entry near College Street would be familiar with the Emden gun. Oh, sorry. Right, and this is the most modern ships that they had. The two down the bottom in particular, the Schornhorst and the Nassau, they had 9.2-inch guns, so much bigger. Sorry, my mistake, 8.3-inch guns. Much bigger guns. So this is how the East Asia Squadron of the Germans and the Australian station compared in firepower. So there's the Emden gun up on the corner. You'll see that's what a 4-inch gun looks like. You'll see the German squadron had 5 ships with 4-inch guns and 2 ships with 8.3-inch guns. HMAS Powerful had 9.2-inch guns. The Yarra, the Parramatta, had 4-inch. The Sydney and the Melbourne had 6-inch. The HMAS Australia had 12-inch guns. So HMAS Australia had the most powerful guns in the Southwest Pacific, and it arrived in Australia in 1914. The state-of-the-art ships being built, there's the Queen Elizabeth the first, 15-inch guns as it was at Gallipoli. And those who know the Gallipoli story might have seen that postcard at the top right of the Queen Elizabeth gunner with his gun. So that's the power balance in the Pacific region. Not only was the barrel size important because of the dimensions of the shell, behind that shell, the amount of explosive charge you could put was an indication of the striking power of the guns. And so graphically, I have shown you here the ships from the bottom, the range that those guns had, and the power. So if you remember your mathematics, the area of a circle is pi r squared. Sorry, circumference. The area of a circle is pi d squared on 4. So that's the power measured on the barrels, tabulated there. You can see the Yarra and Emden are rated at 13 square inches is the size of the back of their shell, 13 square inches. The Queen Elizabeth has 177 square inches on the back of its shell. So the charge you can put behind it is hugely bigger. Look at the HMAS Sydney and the Scharnhorst and Nishu ships. Range is about the same. HMAS Sydney with 6-inch guns is significantly inferior, but could shoot the same distance. Now look at the HMAS Australia. It has a greater range and a far more powerful armament. So when we get to look at Emden and Sydney as a match in the Battle of Cocos Island, you would say that Sydney had the greater range and the greater firepower. So you would expect fewer casualties on the on HMAS Sydney than on the Emden. We'll just hold that thought for a moment because I want to tell you about telegraphic cables. How did the countries, the imperial countries, keep in touch? Well, Britain had the all red line of cables from the UK right around the globe, right around the empire on which the sun never set. So from 1902, it came down through the Atlantic, from Africa, across to Cocos Island, up to India, down to Perth. Across to New Zealand. New Zealand took it up then to through Fanning Island, to Canada and back across the Atlantic. Very fast communications meant instead of 3 months to get a message through, within hours it was there. The development of transatlantic cables, as you can see there, and cables to other parts of the world then followed. And there is a German cable that comes down through to Tenerife and then goes to its African colonies. In 1911, the Committee of Imperial Defence ran a review over the all red line, and they concluded that there were 49 cables that would need to be cut to isolate Britain from the rest of the world. And there was plenty of redundancy in that. And the all red line remained robust and secure right through World War I. In the Southwest Pacific, The pink line is the American cables. The brown line is the German cables. The German cables from Yap at the centre, bottom, that joins the Philippines with Dutch East Indies and provides a connection through to Shanghai as well. That made it a communications headquarters or a hub. Not only that, the Germans developed wireless stations, and I've marked those from down the bottom in Samoa, in Nauru, on the Solomon Islands, as well as the one on Yap and the one in China. So the Germans had cable connections as well as wireless connections. So when war was declared in the UK, they had just completed their mobilisation plan. When I say just completed, the ink dried on it in July 1914. They printed copies. They had a test run of it in July and August 1914, and war was declared on the 4th of August. So what happened next? Well, on the night that war was declared, the first shot of the British Empire was fired in Port Phillip Bay in Melbourne, across the bow of the Pfalz, a German ship that tried to run the blockade at about 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning and was seized. That ship was renamed the SS Barara, and I used to live in Barara Avenue in Oatley. So the next night, the British had their fleet of cable layers. They had 37 cable laying ships, and they were tasked with ripping up those cables. We'll just go back to this graphic, go down to the bottom right corner, and you'll see in the bottom right corner the number of cables coming in and out of Emden, the city, in Germany. There were 7 of them. And the British that night cut all but one of those cables. They also cut the cable from the Germans going down to Tenerife. So that effectively crippled the German cables network that night. The cable they didn't cut was because the British could read the traffic on it. So all German cables had to be channeled through that one cable, and much of it was read. Encryption was not a particularly strong feature at that time. So, back in Australia and New Zealand, on the night of the 6th of August, so the next night, in New Zealand, they received this message: if your ministers desire and feel themselves able to seize the German wireless station at Samoa, we should feel that this was a great and urgent imperial service. And across the ditch, the Governor-General in Australia received, if your ministers desire and feel themselves able to seize German wireless stations at Yap in the Marshall Islands, well, it's actually in the Carolines, Nauru on Pleasant Island, and New Guinea, we should feel this was a great and urgent imperial service. And it went on to say, if you do, we want the land held back if at the end of the war, so it can be dealt with appropriately. So, the German wireless stations in Togoland, in Cameroon, and at Dar es Salaam in Tanzania were destroyed by the Royal Navy. The Australian Naval and Military Expeditionary Force formed in Randwick and was dispatched within weeks. On the 12th of August, the Royal Navy shelled the Yap station and destroyed it. They didn't go ashore and cut the cables, but the cables had already been cut. The 29th of August, the New Zealanders seized and shut down the Samoan wireless station. The Japanese declared war on Germany and laid siege to their base in China. The 9th of September, HMAS Melbourne took a landing party and destroyed the wireless station at Nauru. On the 11th of September, the AN and MEF landed in New Britain. We'll come back to that in a little while. And the siege in Japan by the Japanese went on for months. And finally, the 7th of November, they had captured the German base. Now, because the Japanese had laid siege, the German East Asia Squadron got out of that base and left that base. And so they went off around the Pacific and got coal wherever they could, but they also raided other commercial ships to sustain their supplies. Now, the bottom left is the 9th of November, HMAS Sydney destroys the Emdens at Cocos-Keeling Island. You'll recall that Cocos-Keeling Island was a very significant cable station. So that brings us to the Bismarck Archipelago. Just about done. Brings us to the Bismarck Archipelago, and this is where AE1 and AE2 were sent to take down the wireless station that was there. They did, and the next night AE1 was lost. So it was in this vicinity. You now know why it was in this vicinity. The last part of the story, I'll skip what the official history says. The German East Asia Fleet went across the Pacific and off South America, had a battle at Coromandel with the British fleet and destroyed that fleet. 5 weeks later, they rounded the Cape Horn and went to the Falklands and were totally destroyed by the Royal Navy. That meant that after the Emden was destroyed around Cocos-Keeling Island, there were no longer any German ships in the Pacific. That meant the Australia station's big ships were reassigned to Gallipoli and the Mediterranean. And so this is where I'll hand over to Tim. This is how AE2 got to be where it was and sailing into the Gallipoli campaign, up through the Narrows into the Sea of Marmara. So our next speaker, Tim, is going to tell us the story of the shipwrecks. That's the context.